7-0. And now we are at
Next,
10.
we have two more.
Oh, sorry.
Introduction and adoption of an emergency ordinance to add Municipal Code Section 4.27.080 to the Santa Monica Municipal Code. And did you have a presentation?
Yes, very briefly. Good evening, Mayor and council members. Jonathan Irwin Frank, Deputy City Attorney. I wanted to start with just a brief reminder about eviction protections that are already in place. So we do have the County of Los Angeles COVID-19 eviction moratorium. That does apply from now and since July through the end of the year. But it is different in some ways from what we're offering to you for consideration tonight. So that the first thing is that only applies to tenants who are at 80% of area median income or below. It also requires that the reason for non-payment be COVID-19 related financial distress, and it requires that tenants provide a notice to their landlord, and that is strict in the sense that it has to be within 7 days of when the rent becomes due. And just to give a better sense of what that AMI threshold is, for a household of one, that would be $66,750. For a household of four, that's $93,500. The other thing that I think it's probably worth doing is summarizing one more time what will happen with the rent control ballot initiative. So if that's passed, what will happen is there is a 6% maximum increase, which I'm sure you know is something that has already been noticed for many tenants and can go into effect starting September 1. That will stay the maximum increase. And again, this is presuming that the ballot initiative is passed in November. That will stay the maximum increase through the end of January, and then starting February 1st, the maximum increase will be reduced to 0.8% above what it is now. So the rent for many tenants would actually have to go down. And the idea there is that for the rent control year, which is from September through September, the average rent is going to be 3%. And so what we have for your consideration tonight is a targeted temporary eviction moratorium that is designed to protect tenants who are faced with that 6% increase over this interim stopgap period from September through the end of January. And so that is the rent that's covered. And the way that it works is that in order to qualify, a tenant has to receive a rent increase of more than 3%. Again, that's what that cap is going to be, the average for this year, but then going forward, if the initiative passes, the rent control MAR increase will never be able to be greater than 3%. Tenants will have to provide notice and documentation to their landlord, but that can be in the form of self-certification. Tenants who invoke the moratorium will have until September 1st, 2023 to pay. And the idea there is that tenants will have fully benefited from that reduced rent down to the 0.8% by the time they need to pay back the rent. However, they do need to pay back the entirety of the unpaid rent. And if they don't do that by that September 1st, 2023 date, then they can be evicted or they can be sued for the back rent. And so I think I'll leave it there for now. And if you have questions, I can try to answer those.
Councilmember Davis.
Thank you.
Councilmember Delatorre.
So thank you for that. So I just want to make it clear to anyone who might still be listening, is we sort of have several moving parts here. And the idea, as I understand it, of this emergency ordinance is to make sure that on September 4th, we don't get 3-day notices to quit when people haven't paid their rent on September 1st, where there's a 6% increase. And what this does is basically buy our tenants in rent-controlled units time. One, so that they don't immediately have to pay the 6% while we're working out our tenant, I'm not sure what the right word, our tenant relief program. I mean, we have this tenant relief program we're going to implement, but we're probably not going to have money in people's hands by September 1st. And if they don't pay their rent on September 1st, we'll start to see 3-day notices to pay rent or quit, sort of thing. So one is to sort of help people in this interregnum while we're working on rent relief. And then it also seems that, to give people time to see if the proposed charter amendment passes, so that then they can, as you indicate, will pay what is essentially a yearly maximum of 3%, and then that will be due in September of they'll have till September of 2023 to make good on that. And then if they don't, so what we're really doing is sort of trying to, in a very short period of time, protect tenants from being evicted while we're working out our tenant relief program, and at the same time waiting to see if our charter amendment that amends rent control is going to pass. Is that right?
Yeah, I do think that's a very good summary, and I think, as Ms. McGranahan pointed out earlier tonight, if a tenant misses that 3-day window, very often they're not going to be given more time. And it's exactly what you said. I think it is to make sure that all of our tenants are able to benefit from the ballot initiative, if that does pass, and from that overall 3%, because of course, if they're evicted, they will never be able to benefit from that.
Right, and so in a way, to maybe sum it up, this is in many respects a homeless prevention program, because if on September 1st, we're not necessarily going to have money in people's hands, they're going to get hit with a 6% rent increase that we can't do anything about, and under unlawful detainer law, they can get a 3-day notice to pay or quit, and they could literally be out of their home on September 4th. And so what we really want to do is not have people being evicted from their units, but be able to, one, give the proposed charter amendment time, and also our rent relief program time. So this is really to prevent people from becoming unhoused while all these moving pieces move around. Is that right?
I think that's correct, and that's one of the several reasons this is an emergency ordinance for your consideration.
Okay, great, thank you.
Councilmember Negretti, and then Councilmember Brock, I think. Sorry.
I just wanted to be clear, because you mentioned, I go right into it. I didn't even say hello, good evening. Thank you for being here. You said that it only applies, okay, well, first of all, going back to the eviction moratorium, it's not just, it's the difference. If you just continue to pay your old rent without the increase, right? That's what you're referring to? So if you get an increase of $50 just for simple math, but you continue to pay the rent without the $50 increase, right? Then you're protected, or does it mean that now you can just not pay your entire rent and you're protected under this moratorium?
So the version that is before you, or what is before you, is somewhat broader. So there is a threshold. In order to qualify, you have to have been given an increase that is more than 3%. But once presuming you're a rent-controlled tenant and you have been given an increase of more than 3%, if you then self-certify that you cannot pay your rent for any of those months due to financial distress, then all of the rent for those months could be covered by the moratorium.
Right, so that's the moratorium. And just on that note, so basically, if your rent is $4,750 or more, because that's where it kind of hits the cap of, at that point, you're capped, because 3% would be $142.50 if your rent's $4,750 more. So those people who are at the cap or above do not qualify for this, because at this 3% level, once your rent hits this cap and you're paying $47.50, for example, the cap is $140, which is 3%. Am I making sense here?
This applies to every rent-controlled tenant who may receive an increase of greater than 3%.
Right, but some people won't get that based on the math. Some people won't get a 6% increase.
What she's saying is clear. If your rent is high enough,
Right, depending on the dollar amount
Right.
too.
yeah,
yes.
140 will never exceed 3%.
Right.
Right, so those people are excluded from it. And then He's like, I'm not sure if I follow, but
Oh,
okay.
no, I do follow. I think,
And then-
that's something that if you determine that you wanted everyone to be covered, you could.
Well, because people said that, we shouldn't assume in certain categories that people don't have trouble paying the increase as well. So I was just pointing that out for those that are listening. But the other issue is also, I just want to make sure, because I had some neighbors that were coming over and showing the pass-throughs can add up, right? Depending on your landlord, if they put those through. So this does not include pass-throughs. This is just the rent increase. I know, for example, my rent is capped at the 140, but my rent went to 176 higher because of pass-throughs. So just want to be clear that some people might look at that and say, well, that if they're doing the percentage, I don't want to confuse anyone here. I'm trying to be
Not address the past.
right. I'm just saying that out loud so that anyone listening, because I've had that question and I received 24 emails about the pass-throughs and whether that adds up in relation to this. So it's just the percentage
Of rent itself.
of rent itself.
Right.
So that was my other question. And then when you're self-certifying, what does that mean?
So
Like, how do you
this creates an
self-certify?
affirmative defense to eviction. So if a landlord were to file for eviction, the tenant would have to come forward in response to that and say, I can prove that I have financial distress. And so that's subject to ultimately having to prove it at trial. So it's not a free pass to just say it. They have to ultimately be able to prove it too, if the landlord pursues eviction.
Yeah, she wants to ask a follow-up, but then I have one more question.
So based upon what you just said, if the landlord evicts and then the tenant says, well, I can prove, is it based upon the financials at like that point in time, or do they have to go back and show the financials at the time that they put in the self-certification?
I think, well, probably both. One, that it was true at the time that they made the certification, and then likely that it's still true at the time that they're might be going to trial, which could be maybe 3 months after the landlord files.
Okay.
And the eviction moratorium, just to be clear, is if your rent increases, you're protected from being evicted, period, for non-payment of any rent, or just for the non-payment of the rent increase?
It's any rent for those covered months, provided
Okay.
that you got an increase for that month that is more than 3% and that you couldn't pay due to financial distress.
So if you received a rent increase that was 6%, right? And then you, or 3%, and you don't pay
Right.
your rent for those months, you're
You'd
protected
be covered
from,
under this ordinance, yes.
covered from being evicted.
Right.
And then,
You would have to pay
Prove.
all of that rent, whatever it is that you didn't pay that you invoked the moratorium for, by September 1st, 2023. If you did not do that, then after or on or after September 1st, 2023, your landlord could pursue you for that rent, and they could pursue eviction or a civil remedy, basically a lawsuit seeking the back rent.
I had tenants
is
ask
not
that question,
rent
so I want to be
forgiveness,
clear.
it's
It's
deferral.
not rent forgiveness. I had a lot of tenants ask that question, and so it's just like it was before. It's treated the same way as it was during COVID, the moratorium.
Right, it's deferral.
Okay,
There have been several different moratoriums, and some of them have done, what's effectively a conversion to civil debt where you could never evict for the rent. This is not that. The landlord would have that eviction remedy if the tenant didn't pay back what was owed by that September
first,
1st,
yeah.
2023 deferment date.
I just wanted to confirm because I was confused, and then other people were about if it was covering the entire rent or if it was just that if you didn't pay the higher rent. Do you
This
know
is
what I mean?
for the entire rent.
Got it. Thank you.
And by the way,
For clarifying.
when it comes to financial hardship, we're recommending that we insert COVID-related financial hardship to make it more defensible.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, Councilmember De La Torre, yes, I think you're next, and then Councilmember De La Torre.
So I have real concerns and questions about the last part of the statement that Councilmember Negretti mentioned and you answered and the city attorney answered. You're saying that if, rather than not being able to pay the full 6% increase, the 3%, which is really what they're saying is their hardship. You're saying they can just negate their entire rent, which puts landlords in more of a hole than they were before, because now, instead of having to pay their normal rent plus the increase or be able to certify they can't pay the increase, you're now saying they don't have to pay any rent for a year. And yeah, that's what I'm hearing. And I'm hearing that in addition to not having to pay any rent, you're saying, great, the landlord can evict. Well, I don't want to see more tenants, A, being evicted, or having to go to court, or having to get lawyers. So here's my question. The way I understood our way of helping was people were going to get a 6% increase for 5 months. 5 months. And 4 months, 5 months now. 5 months. And the part that was going to be that was going to be contested was the 6% increase versus the 3% increase that they thought they would have got. So that means the maximum that they should be able to negate for that year is $72 a month. If you took 5 times 72, I'll bet you our tenant fund that the city is proposing that we can fund at least $750,000 can pay that $72 similar to the way the state program worked. The tenant files, the landlord files, and the reimbursement check goes to the landlord for up to $72 a month maximum for 5 months. Anything beyond that, we're not being fair. So we already heard from landlords 2 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago saying inflation is 9%. And we had to give them 6% for 5 months, but then we would cut that down to 0.08. And all right, that's all right. Then they get a balance of 3% for the year. 6% for a lot of people, as Councilmember Negretti said, on a large rent is a lot of money. $140 a month or $140 something a month is a lot. But the reality is that why would we say they could now abate their rent fully from zero for 5 months? That makes absolutely no sense to me whatsoever.
Counsel?
I don't understand where that justification is, because to me, the honorable thing would be to say you're getting more of an increase than you thought, and we're going to try and work with you on that increase. So if you are a low-income tenant and have been stuck with 6%, and the city has some emergency funds we can provide, then we should be providing that. But we should not be providing that on their entire rent, which they already figured they were paying. We're talking really just about the increase, and we should be talking about the amount of the increase that is in excess of what people anticipated they were getting. So if we had to pay 5 times 72, $450, $500 a person, all right, for the people who were in need, we could do that and not end up with any evictions. I kept reading this report and reading about evictions and lawsuits, and boy, and I just said, great. It's great for those attorneys, and it's terrible for those tenants, and it's terrible for those landlords, and it's terrible for our city. I'd like to see us revise this system.
Well,
this is wrong.
Counsel, you know, we heard you before, and there is a second option that we've provided. Call it option 2.
Can you read that option? Because I know you sent
Yes.
it and then.
Well, first I'll summarize it.
Okay.
Basically, it offers up exactly what you're saying, is that the moratorium would apply only to the failure to pay an increase in rent greater than 3%. In other words, if you still have to pay your base rent plus 3%, but you would have protection for failure to pay more than 3%.
And I think that's fair. And I think that helps our tenants. It provides stability for landlords and tenants, for saying that you don't have to pay any of your rent. Even if you get evicted next year, some people will say, hey, I'll gamble on that. Why do we need to do that right now? I think, look at the key is the increase. So I would support option 2. I will not support option one. Thank you.
And just if I can add really quick to that,
Jesus.
to Councilmember Brock's position, because I think it's just a better thought out policy here. Is you also don't want tenants to be falling so much behind on rent. Anyone who's in a financial squeeze, falling deeper into a hole is not healthy for them. Then 5 months later they have this balloon payment they have to make to keep their apartments, and then they're going to come to us and say, hey, look, you all passed a policy saying I didn't have to pay anything, and then now I'm in this huge hole, I need help. And we don't want to have that as well. So I think it makes a lot of sense what the city attorney Sloan has presented us, where housing providers, property owners are going to get some, most of what they need to keep in business. I mean, I've talked to many small mom and pop, property owners here in Santa Monica. It's like, we forced them to do seismic retrofitting. That was a lot of money, thousands of dollars. Most of those jobs were like $86,000 a year, and they had no relief. I mean, this is something we're forcing them to do. They can't pass that cost on to tenants. Everything else from, we talked about this, in terms of the inflation on plumbing services and water rates, which, by the way, we didn't decrease. We're charging even the rent control, registration fees. We increased those. The city did to these property owners. So I just think we need to have a more fair return. And also, I don't want to set these tenants up, especially tenants that are struggling economically, to end up, thinking that, hey, I don't have to pay. And that's just, I think it's a trick. Down the line, you have to have, now a huge amount of money, to keep your apartment, and that's not going to help them. And so anyway, I appreciate the alternative proposal that
I'd like to move the alternative proposal.
Yeah, I'd like
I'll
to
second. Councilmember Delatorre seconded.
Yes, so moved by Negretti, seconded by Councilmember De La Torre,
You're fast.
Councilmember Davis.
So I have a couple of questions before we vote. So as I understand it, for example, a renter can continue to pay some of their rent. I mean, if they don't necessarily have to go in what's been described as this deep hole, they can pay what they can afford, but what this does is buy them some time in these still COVID times to, one, deal with the 6% increase and then see what happens with the charter amendment. There's nothing here that says nobody can pay their rent. They can still continue to pay their rent. And, for example, if a landlord says, gee, I want to continue to get paid rent during this interregnum, I'm going to raise rents 3% instead of 6%, and then they get paid starting September 1st, correct?
That is correct. And again, it's a threshold. So if you did not get higher than 3%, then there would be no eviction moratorium to invoke. You're also correct. It does state that a tenant can pay that money back, in any number of payments or in a lump sum. The only other, go ahead.
Well, and then the other thing was that it sounded like there was some misunderstanding. This only applies to the 5 months that the 6%. I mean, in other words, can someone not pay their rent for the whole year and then in September 1st, 2023, pay a year's worth of rent? Because as I read it, it says it applies to the 5 months that the 6% is in effect. Is that correct?
That's correct. It covers a protected period, which is only those months of the 6%. The September 1st, 2023, that is the date by which the rent would have to be paid back in order to be permanently protected from eviction.
So in theory, beginning March 1st, February 1st?
February 1st.
February 1st, tenants would have to begin paying their rent. They couldn't just say, oh no, I'm excused, I self-certify, I'm not paying rent. So on February 1st, they have to start paying rent. So the only time that's forgiven is between September 1st and the end of January. Is that correct?
Deferred, not forgiven.
Deferred, right. Yeah, forgiven is the wrong word, definitely. Forgiven is the wrong word. The only time they're allowed to defer is during that time period.
That's correct.
Okay, great, thank you. On that basis, I'm going to be opposing the alternative motion.
So just to be clear, this is not saying, because assuming right now people are not in an eviction moratorium, they're paying their rent, right? So there's no eviction moratorium right now.
other than
There's
LA
only
County.
the County of Los Angeles eviction moratorium with the requirements that I
That you just
laid
stated.
out. So that's 80% AMI, COVID-related financial distress,
So that's still,
notice to your landlord within 7 days of when rent is due.
and that still applies.
Yes.
Right, so that's not going away. For anybody who's currently struggling and receive, they can still receive this, they have this rent moratorium based on
County
that
protection.
LA County
Through,
protection. Got
through the
it.
end of December, it would not cover January, which would be covered by this proposal.
And this proposal just does what we were just talking about, to be very clear, that you're covered between the 3% and the 6%, which is what I had understood as well.
That's the option 2,
Right.
right.
Okay, I just wanted to be clear because I don't want to muck up
And
what
there
we
is,
were just.
again, it's set up as an affirmative defense, which then creates a rebuttable presumption. A tenant may be in the position of having to show, if it were actually to be contested in an eviction case, that they were unable to pay, either under Proposal 1, the full rent due to financial distress, or under Proposal 2, being able to show more narrowly that they were not able to pay the increment increase due to financial distress, or under Proposal 2, I guess it would be unable to pay the increment increase due to COVID-19 related financial distress.
And is there a program under the county for still that landlords or tenants can apply for rental assistance in this program? So no, so anyone who's under this moratorium now, who's able to not pay based on the county, what you just outlined from the 80% AMI.
State program.
That was a
Talking
state,
about protection or
yeah,
assistance?
protection, the moratorium
right.
protection that's
Well,
provided by the
With
county.
the limitations that it has, yes.
Right. So right now you're saying that anyone who's in that protection moratorium is not paying their rent under as long as they qualify, that it's going through December so far, unless it's extended, right? We don't know. It could be extended. But under,
Possible.
but under this, you would still be covered through December, but come January, you would just for this 1 month have to pay. We're just talking about 1 month is what I'm trying to say, for anybody who's currently under it.
County version and this version would cover slightly different pools of people that it applies to, but
Right,
yes.
because there's an additional pool of people, right, but it doesn't lessen it. I guess what I'm trying to say, just to make sure that, because I'm hearing what Councilmember Davis is saying, that really we're talking about January, if I'm correct. If I'm somebody who's qualified that falls under this 80% AMI under the county eviction moratorium, and I'm not paying my rent because I qualify, I am not impacted with what we're doing here until January 1st, in which case I could then say, I can pay my rent with the 3% increase, or I'm going to have to pay that, cannot pay the additional 3%, and I show proof to the city of Santa Monica to then be covered under that and get the additional assistance. And then come February 1st, everybody is back to having to pay, is going down to the 0.08, correct?
Assuming the charter amendment passes.
Okay. I'm making that clear for myself, and I don't know if I just confused everybody else.
Well, but let me, excuse me 1 minute. So there's one thing, there are two things. First of all, I think that this incentivizes landlords to charge 3% from the get-go, because then this protection isn't available, because the protection is available only if it's only over 3%. So anybody who only charges the 3% won't be subject to this ordinance.
But isn't that a good thing?
Excuse me, I'm not quite done. And then my next question is this: on the backfill program, it's my understanding that the only thing that we are agreeing to pay is the difference between the 3% and the 6%. We aren't paying all of their rent, but the argument that you were making that then we'll owe all of this money doesn't apply, because all we are really backfilling is the 3%. And I'm looking at the city attorney, the city manager, and asking that.
It- Can I try and answer that in the meantime? And I have two questions while the city manager looks that up.
Sure.
Okay, one, in response, the assistant city attorney said originally when I asked this question, if someone couldn't pay the increase, they could choose to defer their entire rent for September, October, November, December, January, and then repay it by the following September, or start repayment in September. That's correct to what you said?
You would have to pay the entirety of the amount that you didn't pay prior to September 1st, 2023.
But the first part of what I said then was true, which you said that people could defer their entire rent for those 5 months because they couldn't theoretically pay the 3% increase. And that's why I proposed that we use this alternative. I have a question. You mentioned that some people could pay, if there was a good landlord, the good landlord could just charge them 3% starting in September. And I think Mayor Himmelrich backed that up a minute ago. My question, though, is do they still have to decrease their rent increase to 0.08% in March, or can they just maintain it at 3% for the year? Does my question make sense?
Yes, it does. I believe we handled that in the charter amendment.
We did.
It-
No, they
Have to
it's just
reduce it.
flat.
If-
It's-
It was the whole
so-
thing that if they charge 3%,
They could
they
just stay
charge
at
3%
3%.
through the whole year.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm fine with that part. So we don't have to worry about that in this because that's in the charter amendment that would go to voters. So if a landlord wanted more stability, rather than try and take that quick fix of extra money now, they could just go 3%, not have to do separate forms, not have to go back and forth. And Mayor, you were saying then that negates
Well, because this ordinance only applies
in excess of 3.
if they're charging in excess of 3, so it's an additional incentive to charge only 3 as opposed to trying to get your 6 right up front.
That part I like and agree with.
No, I'm saying
But-
either one,
Yeah.
either one.
Right.
It doesn't matter because the ordinance, the threshold for it is the 3%. So
And-
if you're below 3, if you're at 3 or below, you're fine.
And then my last question would be, there was consternation about the month of January 2023. The county may have ended their moratorium by then. We would not have a moratorium for that month, so theoretically, a really crappy landlord could try and evict in January if someone couldn't pay that extra 3% increase. Is that the question? Is there a fix that we?
So it lines up to February?
Is,
Well, ours goes till February 1st. Both of the versions here go to February 1st.
okay, so
Right.
we're covering till February no matter what. No matter what the county does, no matter what we do, everyone's covered. Nobody can be evicted if they can't pay that full 6% that a landlord decides to charge. That's what I want to know, and that's in here.
On both versions, yes.
All right, thank you.
I guess, sorry. I think Councilmember Davis was saying like the LA County covers to December 31st. It could be extended, we don't know that, but in the instance that it doesn't, I guess I'm just trying to make sure people are protected all the way through.
My concern is that the pool of people who are eligible to take advantage of the county program is a smaller pool than the tenants that are being rent burdened by our 6% increase, because we have people who are making above 80% AMI who are still rent burdened.
Right.
And LA County program only protects people up to 80% AMI, and they also have to make some other certifications that are different than what we're requiring. They have to jump through a lot more hoops to get in that program. So for me, as the mayor pointed out, if someone says, I'm a landlord and I want to continue to get my rent in September, October, November, December, they can raise the rents 3%, and they will keep that 3% throughout 2022 and until September 1, 2023, when whatever the new general adjustment kicks in. But if we say, okay, we're only going to let people who are burdened by that delta if you will, of the 3%, that's going to be a lot harder, I think, for people to prove. And so if we're depending on the county ordinance to protect people, there are going to be people who fall through what could be in a potentially very large crack. And those people could end up without housing in the interregnum.
I think what's confusing for me is this whole time we've been talking about an increase and about the fact that it should be 3% and where the increase should be. I didn't know we were now talking about, I feel like this is a separate thing that we might need to discuss about rent moratoriums in its entirety. Like, we're talking about two things, like people who can't pay their rent at all and what group you fall into, because I pointed out that, yes, you're exactly right, because we heard people who are rent burdened that pay above that cap, right? So someone paying $4,750, they might be rent burdened too, but they're at the 140, so they don't get to apply for any of this help just by the nature of the cap. So I guess what I'm saying is there's two things going on here. I thought we were talking about this increase and the difference, and that's where we were coming in and helping to make sure people, A, do not lose their homes over this massive increase, and B, that are able to receive the help so that it also suffices that the landlord gets that difference if someone can prove it. So that's where I'm drawing confusion on the two.
Well, and if I can add one thing, from the landlord's perspective, and again, this is all contingent on our rent control charter amendment passing, but I'm going to keep my fingers crossed and hope the voters come through on that. Landlords are still only going to get 3% over the course of the year. That's how the charter amendment is constructed. So if I'm a landlord, presumably, and I don't want to allow my tenants to get the rent deferral for those 5 months, I'll just go to 3%, which is what I'm going to get in any event if the charter amendment passes. So why not, as the mayor says, provide this incentive for landlords to stay at the 3%. They'll get 3% each of the 12 months of 2022 through September 1, 2023, which is, if the charter amendment passes, the total return they'll get anyway. The only difference is if the charter amendment passes, they'll get 6% for 5 months, and then they'll get 0.8% for 7 months. But it's constructed so that it's 3% over the course of the year. So I like the idea of the carrot of saying this is a way to reduce the rent that people will have to pay without it presumably negatively impacting landlords, because if the charter amendment passes, all the landlords are going to get anyway.
So I hear you now. So I'm just clarifying for myself, because this is I see now that we're using proposal 1 as a tool to change it to 3% immediately, because we couldn't do that unless we went to we had to put it to the voters. In essence, that's what we're saying, that this is a way to, and a carrot and right, I get that. So I didn't know that that was the discussion and the plan, that this was what we were doing to make it to go to 3% immediately, which overall we're going to 3% across the year. The only concern I had was, or the confusion, I didn't know that that's what we were discussing. This whole time I thought it was about people not being able to pay this difference, and that was the whole discussion. And I hear you that this now gives an incentive, because then the landlords say, well, geez, I don't want to have to deal with someone saying they can't pay any of their rent now. And so to go back to your proposal, you're saying that in the version in the original one says if it's 3%, what you're saying, if any, and landlord's going to go, well, then why would I charge more? I'm going to end up getting 3% anyways. So this is just an incentive to go ahead and make it to the 3% and not bother with the 6 and go back to 0.8. And so.
Right. And counsel, that was not the motivation for designing it that way. That's an indirect effect.
However we want to lay it out. I mean, motivated indirect effect. So this is the effect. You get to this 3% faster instead of doing all this confusing 6 and 8 and notifying everybody. Essentially, I think the only thing I was concerned about was like, oh no, does this inspire people to just, now we're going to have this problem where people are in the hole because they're not paying. And then on the other end, small mom and pop landlords are, in the hole as well. So now I'm understanding what is going on much clearer, and I needed to clear that up for myself. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor.
There is
Sorry, oh, I
a-
didn't mean to do.
There is another problem that I just was alerted to, is that if a landlord gave the 6% increase notice August 1st, they can't switch it now. They'd have to give a new 3% notice September 1st. So then the 6% would still be there for September. So that throws yet another wrench in, a little wrench, but for the landlords who I was hoping would be good and just go 3% for the year, right? Which balances out their income more completely. They can't even do that for September. They'd have to file a new notice, right, and do a new notice for October 1st, so September would still be an issue. But I hope landlords would do that. And I'm still supporting the alternative measure, which we have a motion and a second for.
I have a question.
Yes.
I just wanted to know in terms of the legality about self-certification. I read that there's a U.S. Supreme Court decision. There's a case, I can get you the case. Anyway, y'all probably know about this case, that found that self-certification to be improper and unconstitutional. And I just wanted to get clarity from legal counsel.
The difference here is that this is an affirmative defense, so due process would be provided in the eviction process.
The only thing I would add is that that's something that we've done. That's something that self-certification, the County of Los Angeles moratorium uses, and as well as the state eviction moratorium.
The tenant still has to ultimately prove it.
Yeah. But it sounds, I mean, from the ordinances, it would be, they would just have to say, you know, I can't afford to pay the rent,
That's what they do
Right.
now.
the increase.
If the landlord did not believe the tenant, the landlord could proceed with the eviction and the tenant would have to prove it.
Okay.
But again, for my part at least, I don't want to see evictions. I want to not see landlords go, oh, I can go to court and try and get rid of someone, because I don't want that in the city. And I don't want us, it felt, when I read the first version, that it felt like we were providing an incentive to say, hey, let's launch lawsuits, and I don't want to see that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Speaking to Oscar, because I made the motion on the second, but after all of that discussion, I'm now feeling like we're voting on the first and not this, because this incentive, it feels like,
We're voting on the second.
We're voting on the second.
well, I'm just pointing out that
You can change your
in this
vote.
discussion,
So do you want to pull your second?
well, that's what I was saying, if I'm pulling my second, because
Your first.
my first, I made the motion, so
The
So
motion.
you're withdrawing your
I'm
motion?
withdrawing my motion after that
I
conversation.
will move that we vote on the alternative. Because the
Counsel,
first one still says that people can abate their rent temporarily for up to 5 months. Their full rent, not just the increase.
Right, but so what I'm saying is we just had this whole discussion about the incentive, and it sounds like it only lies if it's within the first motion, in the first version.
Then we can always amend version 2. The problem with the
then
first
amend it.
one is that people don't have to
Right.
pay their rent for up to 5 months, period. Now,
If
look,
their rent
I don't
is-
think it's smart to do that.
Only if the
because
increase is
you're putting
above
yourself
3.
in a hole. But
Or
they
we can make a
decide to do that.
substitute motion to
The
go
trick.
with the original proposal, and that's what I'm going to do. I move that we go with the original proposal to abate all of the rent. As, again, because this is a carrot and stick. Really what it is it means you can't be evicted, and it doesn't mean you can't pay your rent. It just means you can't be evicted, and eviction has become a major problem here. I think that eviction is the problem. So I believe that the carrot is to get the landlords to charge 3% instead of 6% at the beginning, and not try to trap the landlords, trap the tenants with the 6%.
But they can't do that this month. Again, they still would have to charge the 6 for September.
if I could address that, counsel. The landlord may not be able to, at this point, unilaterally change the rent notice from 6% to 3%, but the landlord tenant could agree to pay and accept only 3%.
But in the meantime, look, I'm going to repeat the same thing that I said at the beginning. The concern I had, which will lead to more evictions, is the tenant says, great, I can sock this money away and not have to pay it. And then next September, they weren't able to pay it back. Meanwhile, the landlord who was suffering from 9% inflation, who is already losing their booty right now on their rent for the next 5 months, they're already suffering for the next year because the maximum they can get is 3% when inflation is 9%. Now we're saying a tenant, well-meaning or not, can decide not to pay any rent for the next 5 months. Any rent, not just the increase, any rent under version 1. That is a mistake.
If that happens, and I don't know how, but if that happens, what we will be incentivizing is for some small housing providers to go out of business. You know, most of the evictions that we've seen, or at least a huge amount of evictions that we've seen, is because of the use of the Ellis Act, and you know, housing providers getting out of the business. And so I think that we need to find a way to support those small mom and pop operators in the city. They're good landlords. You know, there's organizations even called Progressive Landlords of Santa Monica. These are, I know these people. They want to stay in business, and they have a relationship with their tenants. We want to keep them in business. If we lose them to Ellis Act, you know, transitions, we're going to end up losing affordable housing in the city of Santa Monica.
Corporations are the ones.
Excuse me, I didn't call on you, Councilmember Davis and then Councilmember Negretti. Thank you.
So I just want to make a couple of points. And I'm not sure I'm going to characterize this right. The structure of the two alternatives is the same. It's just where they apply. So to Councilmember Brock's point about, well, I don't want to see litigation. You're going to see the litigation in any event. They're just going to file an eviction or an unlawful detainer action for the people who can't pay the additional 3%. In other words, you're still going to have litigation surround, and then because in both instances, if the landlord decides to file an unlawful detainer, this operates as an affirmative defense. That's how this comes into play. Is that correct?
Correct.
In both instances. So both, in a sense, sort of turn on. This only becomes an issue when a landlord tries to evict a tenant during this period, whatever this period is.
Right.
Is that correct? And then the second thing I want to address is Councilmember De La Torre's statement, which is, certainly I think we're all sympathetic to the idea that we want landlords to stay in business. Assuming, and again, this is an assumption, and we all know what they say about assume, but assuming the charter amendment passes, mom and pop landlords are still only going to see a 3% rent increase over the course of the upcoming 12 months. Now, if it may be that they get the 6% up front and then they get the 0.8%, or they make a decision, and I think the city attorney is absolutely right, even if they've already given notice on the 6%, they can voluntarily go to their tenant and say, I am not going to evict you if you only pay me 3%, and oh, by the way, here's a revised rental notice increase that going forward, I'm only going to pay you 3%. So either way, the mom and pop landlords get the same rate of return because, again, yes, and I can see you making a face, Councilmember Brock, in theory, if the landlord says, no, I want my 6% and I want my 6% now, then yeah, they may be in a position where they don't get paid that for a few months. But again, this is not rent forgiveness, this is rent deferral. Ultimately, they will recover that money. But if it truly is for mom and pop landlords or anyone else a concern about having a steady rate of not losing rent for those 5 months, then it behooves them to say, okay, tenant, I'm going to take 3% in the month of September. I'm not going to file an unlawful detainer action against you, and here's a revised notice of rental increase going forward until September 21, 2023, that your rent increase is only going to be 3%, and then the tenant has to pay. So it's not as if we're somehow taking that flexibility away from the landlords, and in fact, we're giving them the flexibility to say, I'm going to get a 3% rate of return, again, assuming the charter amendment passes, or a 3% rent increase. And I'm either going to get it 6% for 5 months, 0.8% for 7 months, or I'm going to get it, 3% steadily over the year. So nobody's taking money out of landlords' pockets. And it's really up to the landlords. If they want to run the risk that their tenants are going to avail themselves of this opportunity, then sure, they can go ahead and charge more than 3%. But if they don't want their tenants to avail themselves of this opportunity, then they can charge 3%. And either way, they get the same amount of money. So we're just giving the landlords, whether they're mom and pop or institutional, the opportunity to decide how they want to get their 3% over the course of the year. That's all that's happening. One does not give them more rent increase than the other, again, assuming the charter amendment passes. So I'm not sure why we need to do a lot of hand-wringing about landlords, with all due respect to every landlord in the city, because it's within their power to make it so that their tenants have to pay rent effective October 1st. And if they go to their tenant and say, look, if you pay the rent in September, I'm only going to charge you up to 3%, then it seems to me they're still getting the same amount of money. It's just math. No matter how you slice the bread, they're going to get 3% over the course of the year.
And wait, hold on. I was next. I understand that, and that's what I wanted you to hear. That I heard it the first way you did. So after listening, like she just said, it's 3% regardless. The only time this you can't pay your entire rent applies is if it's over the 3% increase. So I think the amendment could be, we need to make an amendment to handle, because we're sort of forcing you were saying this, it's this carrot and stick, and I get that. Any landlord would say, well, then I'm not going to deal with that. Any smart landlord, I'll just do the 3% now. But now that we've already given out the rent increase and people are paying that new increase in a few days, how can we amend this to cover that first month so that the landlords aren't in that position? Do you know what I'm saying? So this initial month of above 3% doesn't put them in this position where they're now in this eviction moratorium, because I don't even know how that would cover. Is it just 1 month and then they go to 3% and then, you know what I'm saying?
In other words, if they go to 6% September 1st, but
Because
then
they already did.
3% on October 1st?
Right.
Can we put a clause in such as any landlord who automatically or who issued a 6%?
Prior to us doing
Yeah,
this.
prior to this.
Right, because they should, not a lot of, that's what I wanted to say, not everybody's watching these meetings. And I don't know who's organized enough. They have management companies. So I think if we could cover that month to protect both ends, the tenants and the landlords, that would be the most fair thing, because we're coming up with this now again late in the evening, a few days before the new increase goes out. It's not impacting anyone the way you're thinking it is.
Yes, it is.
Okay, explain.
My family and many friends have been landlords for 70 years in Santa Monica and LA. Very small landlords, but landlords nonetheless. You'll end up with a tenant who says, I got a 6% increase. The landlord won't be able to change that quickly enough. And they'll say, well, we don't have to pay anything for 5 months. So for heaven's sake, why wouldn't we take out that loophole and stop the argument?
You're not
Very
hearing.
simple.
I think you're not hearing.
No, I
No,
am hearing.
But we are
Take
saying
out,
that.
wait, let's make it simple. I
How do
had
you
one request, whether it be option 1 or option 2. Take out the clause that says a tenant
That's
can
what we're saying.
abate their full rent and say they can only abate the amount of the increase over 3%.
That's what we're saying. That's what I'm saying. No, that's
it's
what I'm
not
asking
in-
right now.
It's not in either clause. So
That's what I'm asking right now. It was my turn. So I said, given that it's August 20, whatever it is right now, it's too soon. It's a week away. So my mic is on and I took the floor to ask the very question that you're now excitedly proposing, that it's not fair to the tenants or the landlords, given the timing, that they should not be responsible since we're reading this tonight. If we had passed it and we didn't understand it clearly, we're having the discussion. So now that we've cleared it up, we should do something about September so that this does not occur. Does that make sense? And I'm turning to you to come up with
Right.
the appropriate
I think we
language.
could insert language that says that it doesn't apply if a landlord issues a revised rent notice to not exceed 3% or doesn't collect more than the 3% increase.
But
Wait, say that again?
So
That-
what they're saying is if the landlord now, despite having issued the 3% thing, either revises the notice to say, this, having issued the 6%, either revises the notice to say 3% or only collects 3%. So regardless of what the notice says, if they've only collected 3%, then this does not apply.
So what if the residents hear this meeting prior to their landlord, which is very common, and they decide, well, I'm going to go ahead and write in my rent increase with just the 3% and hope I'm going to use what was talked about at council that I'm covered. How do we cover all our bases?
Well, if the tenant pays only a 3% increase, then I think they're covered under either version of the ordinance.
Well, we got to be clear because I don't want to set someone up for eviction. I think that's what we're trying to do.
Right, and either version of the entrance, they'd be covered of the ordinance.
The landlord's charging
Right.
them 6%. They're only paying 3%.
Right.
But the landlord has sent out the 6%. For those good landlords who say, okay, you only have to pay 3% and I'm revising
But
the
let's look at the
notice.
worst case scenario, Brock, let's look at the worst case scenario. Because we're talking about the same thing. I want you to hear this. Worst case scenario. We're coming to an agreement and it makes sense. I think if you're agreeing and you're hearing what I'm saying. A worst case scenario, they sent out the 6%, even with hearing this meeting and understanding they don't want to change it. Now, does that mean that that person can abate their rent for 5 months, or is it just this 30 days and then they have till December to pay it?
We could
This is-
clarify at minimum that it applies as long
Let's
as the
do that.
6% has been increased. In other words, if October 1st they go back to 3%,
Then
it
it,
wouldn't apply. We can make sure that language would be inserted, if that's the version that you want to go with.
that's the amendment I'm proposing, so we protect
Perhaps
ourselves.
to just say that no landlord who has collected rent from a rent-controlled resident by more than 3%. So they would have to actually collect it. So they could negotiate collecting less, even though they've given notice.
I understand that, but I'm a rent-controlled tenant, okay? And I know you live in an apartment too. I don't know about you, but I don't have a relationship with my landlord where I knock on his door or call him up because he owns 38 buildings, okay? So I don't text my landlord. I don't think he wants to text me. So the chances of me negotiating, I don't want that pressure and I wouldn't want to put that on residents. So I think we need to do something a little bit better than putting it off on the residents that they've got to negotiate with their landlord. Most people don't want to engage with their landlord about rent decrease, increase. So if we could just make it really clear, we're presenting this as the city, we should take the onus of what's happening. And maybe it means we have to cover
We should
that
pay for
rent.
it.
We
I
should
think
pay for it. Like if
we-
people can't pay that month, we
The
use the
city government-
$750,000 we have to assist people for this month that they can't pay their rent, since we're doing it so late in the evening on, before rent's due on the 1st, right? So if rent is due on the 1st and people are unable to pay, I mean, we've got to figure something out where it's not on the residents to have to call up their landlord and negotiate this.
So let me just chime in, and City Attorney Sloan, just
You want to listen to
let me keep me on track with this comment. So our rent control relief program will cover the rent. I think part of what this is meant to help address is, so our application period starts Monday and goes through September 19th. So there's definitely going to be a timing issue, which is, I think, part of what this eviction moratorium helps to kind of stem, because otherwise, right, folks who don't pay September 1st have an issue in the absence of this ordinance before we can get money flowing. So I want to make sure I got that right, because that's how, and I know Councilmember Davis, you were trying to sort of sum that up, but I want to just come back to that point, because that's kind of the problem that I think this helps to solve for, because we can't, we just don't have enough time to get in front of the September 1st timing with money.
Right.
You're saying that we're covered through the application process,
Goes through September.
and this eviction
19th.
moratorium covers people. So in essence, there could be people who got the 6%. They just say, I can't afford any of it, and under this new eviction moratorium, I'm not paying anything. They apply, and there could potentially be money to cover their entire rent for that month?
No, this will cover
Right.
the increase
The-
in the rent. and
The
max
$70,
will-
let's just
yeah,
say, if
and
you're
the
on.
max will covers up to 140, so we're only covering the increase.
But I think it's important to note that this only comes into play when the landlord tries to evict the tenant. So if the landlord knows that there is relief coming down the pike that's going to help the tenant, if the landlord is willing, in my mind, to be reasonable and say, I'm only going to take 3%, nobody has to lose their housing during September. And in terms of notifying people, I mean, the one thing we do know is who all our rent control landlords are. I mean, they have a lot of documentation they have to file. And so it seems to me we can notify them as soon as we get out of this meeting, hey, this is what we're doing. But again, I think it's important to note, with all due respect again to our landlords, is one, if they're willing to be patient and let our rent relief program come into effect to help people, they just don't have to file an unlawful detainer action to evict anyone in September, in which case, and they can go to the tenant and say, if you pay me the 3% increase, I'm not going to move to evict you out. You get to stay in. We don't have a problem. I'm going to send you a new formal notice that effective October 1st, your rent officially will only go up 3%. In the meantime, the tenants who are really stressed even by whatever it is have the right to apply within the parameters the city manager described earlier this evening for rent relief. So the idea that somehow on September 1st, people are going to stop paying rent and landlords are going to go bankrupt, I think is a little apocalyptic and a little hyperbole at this point in time, because it is within the landlord's control about how they want to react to this. And even if they want the 6%, but they think, gee, maybe I want to wait for this rent relief program to come in, they just don't have to file an unlawful detainer action against the tenant for not paying rent on September 2nd. And I know actually we do have some landlords who have worked with tenants who've had problems and said, I understand you're getting, paid on the 15th. I'll take the rent on the 15th or whatever. So it's not as if sort of this is out of the landlord's control and they're immediately going to get screwed by this system. The only time this comes into effect is when they try to evict the tenant. If they don't try and evict the tenant for non-payment of rent and let the program for rent relief come into effect and are willing to accept 3%, then nobody's ox gets gored.
Well, there's also,
hold on.
just
Whoa, whoa, whoa,
one
whoa.
other nuance I
Excuse
just
me.
want to make sure, I think it's important to this conversation that I think Assistant City Attorney Cola mentioned, is that the one provision I believe I heard you say you want to add into this is that it has to be attributable to COVID-19. So that
Right.
really limits the applicability that this ordinance will actually impact people. So I just want to make sure we're not really talking about the universe of rent control tenants. We're talking about those folks who will have a COVID-19 justification. So it's a smaller population. That's what I heard. And I just want to make sure that's clear.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to point out that I'm just feeling a tone of frustration, like, if we get out of here, like as if we're belaboring this. I think it's important to be clear. After what happened the last time, when there's no clarity and no ability to have a discussion, then we move forward making a lot of assumptions, and a lot of assumptions were made off of the last conversation we had up here about what council members were proposing and talking about. So I just want to be mindful that while we're sort of scoffing and laughing at, and there's like, maybe we all know all the landlords off the top of our head, I don't think that that's always true. I talk to tenants every day because I live and breathe it, and people come and ask me all the time these questions. They don't know and they don't watch, including landlords. So I just want to be clear that I feel like while we're sort of going, oh, if we can do this now, we're doing it at this late time before September 1st. Like, had this discussion been brought forward earlier, maybe that message would have reached the tenants, the landlords, and we would have all seen a 3%. But I got my full max plus pass-throughs. And so I'm just pointing out that it's important. I made the mistake, the grandiose mistake of having a conversation and bringing up something in the wee hours of the morning. And so now we're having this discussion, and I would just want to have a lot of clarification for people who are watching or listening or watching it tomorrow and following up so that they're clear on their options and what this is intended to do. So I just want to respect that process. And while some of us may not clip on to all the legal information as quickly, because clearly we're all having a discussion up here as to what it really means and the carrot and the stick, and going back to making sure we're addressing the entire community, and in particular that residents aren't put in a position where they're surprised or they're evicted, or this is used as a tool for eviction. So I think we're covering all our bases, and I think we're all doing a pretty good job of doing that. We're having a robust discussion over it, and I just want to be able to do that and move on to this. So you made the motion.
I made the motion. Did I hear a second?
But did we put any additional language in there? Was there a substitute motion?
Clarification, this is back to the original motion.
The original motion, and there was some clarifying language. We added the language about COVID, and then we need the language about September.
Can we just be clear on what that language is?
Either version.
Well, in the
Right.
in the original
So the
version.
original motion was option 2. The substitute motion was option 1.
Correct.
But then I withdrew, so we went back to.
Okay.
But then Councilmember Brock made the original,
No, but then she's saying after I withdrew it, then Councilmember Brock went back
made the
to.
same one, and I made a substitute motion.
Right.
Did you get a second for your motion?
Not,
I'll second it.
And in that substitute motion, we have the clarifying language and the substitute motion that Mayor Himmelrich presented.
To clarify, either version would like to have the same clarifying language
Well, that's up
on
to,
on both COVID and
let's start with
September
this
1st.
version that we're voting on right now.
Okay. The substitute motion would be voted on first.
The substitute motion, which is the original ordinance.
Correct.
Plus the changes.
Right, which is the limitation to financial stress due to COVID, and the fact that any landlord who is willing to, and I don't know what language you use, but accept 3%, even having given the 6%, they can then go
Right,
forward.
it's not
and
subject to this.
Right.
everybody can't.
Yes, Councilmember Brock.
Your mic's not on. Your mic.
Thank you, Denise. I wish to amend the motion that's been made to extract the portion that says that someone could defer their rent for the 5 months. They should only be able to defer the increase, period. This is what we started off this conversation now an hour ago with something I thought was really simple. They should be able to defer their increase if necessary, but they should not be able to defer their entire rent. So my amendment, I guess amendment or substitute motion?
Well, no.
Isn't that what option 2 is?
This is a substitute motion, so we have the substitute motion on the floor, which is the original with the amendment.
So does
So I'd like to add that one last amendment. It
And
was
that
very
is not
simple.
friendly to the maker. I am the maker, and I don't believe that's friendly.
So you still want to let people defer their entire rent if they want for 5 months?
If their
Okay.
rent has been raised more than 3%,
But
and if their rent has been raised more than 3%, and if their landlord tries to evict them, yes.
It's the two things that have to happen.
And how was it it was so simple just to eliminate that portion that said they could defer their rent for 5 months?
But this was my point.
How was this conversation?
We had to have this conversation to clarify it. He came up and
You
laid
did?
it out, but we did.
Okay,
Okay, let's have a vote.
all right.
Oh, do you want to,
No, I'll just vote and then I'll explain why I voted.
okay,
Okay. Are we ready?
yep.
I'm just
So
saying
the
you need
motion
5
that's up
votes.
right now is not my motion.
It's an emergency ordinance, so it
So it
requires
needs to be
5
taken
votes.
off the motions.
Oh, it needs
Oh, I'm
5
sorry.
votes?
Hold on.
Did you guys hear that? Did
What?
everybody hear that? Because he was saying something I didn't hear.
We need 5 votes. It's an emergency ordinance.
So do we need to discuss anymore?
Then let's
Are we discussing?
Yes.
Okay, so we're back to the original.
Don't leverage.
Oh, yeah, mine
Are you guys ready to vote?
Yeah.
Yes.
Leverage you guys to vote.
All right. Councilmember Para,
Yes.
Oh,
you put no. Oh, yes, okay. Okay. Councilmember Davis?
Yes.
Councilmember Negrete?
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem McCowen?
Yes.
Councilmember Brock?
No.
Councilmember De La Torre?
No.
And Mayor Himmerich?
Yes, so that passes 5-2.
Yeah. I want to explain my vote, on my no vote. I just feel that, we're creating a division between landlords, housing providers, and tenants, and I just think it's not the right way to go about this. I think we're going to incentivize people, getting out of the housing business in Santa Monica, and I think we're going to lose affordable housing, and I think renters in the end are going to pay the price. So that's why I voted no.
I'll also mention that what I've said already is that I supported the city helping pay the increases for those tenants who were in trouble on the 6% increase. We created tonight with this vote more confusion for landlords, more confusion for tenants. It increases the paperwork for rent control. It increases the amount of paperwork for the city. It was something that was pretty simple that we just spent an hour on, and pardon me, but we didn't use common sense. So I voted no, not against renters, but to keep the process simple and clean for all renters and all landlords in the city. And I'm disappointed that we just spent this hour of our lives discussing something that should have been taken care of in 5 minutes. Thank you.
I think that all the time.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next item,
Okay,
please.
so the next one is introduction and first reading of an ordinance amending the city's tenant protection laws.
Good evening, Mayor Pro Tem, and council members. I'm Gary Rhodes. I'm a Deputy City Council or Deputy City Attorney.
And we owe you congratulations, I think, on your latest injunction, right? Your Section 8, is that?
Yes.
Congratulations on that great
All of
victory.
us, yes, thanks. This set of amendments has 5 proposed changes to our tenant protection ordinances. The first proposed amendment is to our Fair Housing Ordinance, also known as the Anti-Housing Discrimination Ordinance. Our Fair Housing Ordinance, like the city, like the state and federal fair housing ordinances, prohibits housing discrimination by landlords based on protected classes. And in 2015, this city council added source of income to that list of protected classes. And in a pioneering move, they added to the definition of source of income, Section 8 voucher holders or anyone else receiving rental assistance. And that definition has resulted in, many applicants and tenants in Santa Monica being able to turn no's by landlords into yeses. And that's been due to the help of the Housing Authority, the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles, and our own office's enforcement program. So it's been a very successful program. Other cities and even the state have consulted with us on how to make that happen for them. Tonight's amendment clarifies what exactly, what are some of those protections. And the 2 main things it does is it clarifies that both existing tenants and prospective tenants are protected under the new under this relatively new protected class. The other thing it does is it clarifies that delays by landlords in filling out paperwork that's needed and returning that paperwork to the Housing Authority can be a type of discrimination. And as you heard in the public comments period that was made by Denise McGranahan, it's a very common problem. LAFLA sees it all the time. We see it all the time. Her very vivid image of the paperwork being on the back of a turtle. That is appropriate. And by the time that turtle gets over there, if it ever gets over to the housing authority, the tenant has often moved on. They've had to settle for substandard housing somewhere, or left Santa Monica and for other housing. So we'd like to clarify these two things. That will help us. It will help LAFLA, and it will help the housing authority make more connections between voucher holders and landlords. So that's amendment number one. Amendment number two, we're also wanting to add some specific examples to our tenant harassment ordinance. Our tenant harassment ordinance prohibits certain types of conduct by landlords that are made in bad faith. And one particular prong, and this is at prong F in the code, prohibits landlords from influencing or attempting to influence a tenant to vacate a rental unit through fraud, intimidation, or coercion. And given our years of experience with enforcing this ordinance and the questions we get, we think it'll be helpful to add some specific examples of fraud, coercion, and intimidation. So those examples are excessive rent increases, baseless threats to evict, threats to report immigration status, terminating tenancy on a fraudulent basis of owner occupancy, and excessive and baseless entries. So those are all examples we've seen. We've litigated actually most of these successfully, and we just want to be able to, point to the law and show landlords early on that this is clearly unlawful activity, and that will help us probably deter this conduct and probably prevent it as well. So that's amendment number two. The third amendment is also from our tenant harassment ordinance. Another prong in that ordinance is it prohibits landlords from violating state and federal fair housing laws, especially in bad faith, so that a fair housing violation can also be a tenant harassment ordinance violation. That list under that prong is a closed list, and it has some protected class. It has a list of protected classes that have since been kind of outdated. For example, it's missing source of income, and it's missing immigration status. So we want to add those two for sure, because we see those in Santa Monica. We've litigated those two protected classes in Santa Monica. And then we also just want to make this an open list instead of a closed list. So the language that we've added to make that open is it will include any other class protected by a local, state, or federal law. So moving on to the fourth proposed amendment, eviction reporting. This would be virtually identical to a emergency order that we've had in place since 2020. It requires landlords to report to the city any attempted evictions or unlawful detainers, and then follow-up information about whether what the outcome was and what was the legal representation on both sides. We're trying to figure out what we want. This helps the city assess the impact of evictions on our community, and also assess this issue of legal representation. How is the deck stacked on one side or the other, and what is the impact of, especially LAFLA's work through the Right to Counsel program on, trying to even the odds here. And then finally, the Fifth Amendment addresses an issue we've seen where landlords will send tenants a notice that will change the lease, they say, and it will change the attorney's fees provision in that lease to say to either cap the amount of attorney's fees that either side can get in litigation that may come up between the landlord and the tenant, or that there would be no attorney's fees exchanged. Now, our tenant harassment law in our fair housing law specifically provides for attorney's fees for tenants who win under those claims. And most civil rights laws do. The California's fair housing law does that too. So when a landlord sends a notice like this to a landlord, the tenant is going to be perhaps misled into thinking, oh, well, I guess I can't pursue attorney's fees in those cases. So they may not pursue them. I would guess that even, some attorneys may not realize that. They may see that letter when the tenant brings it to them and say, well, it's going to be hard for me to be able to afford to take this case because there's not attorney's fees at the end of it. So we propose that when a landlord proposes to change the attorney's fees provision, that they provide a notice, and we've provided the language for that notice that would clarify that for some laws, such as our tenant harassment ordinance and our fair housing ordinance, that those fees can't be waived or shifted back. So those are our 5 proposals in a nutshell. I'll take questions on any of them now.
Any questions? Yes, Councilmember Davis.
So my first question was, Ms. McGranahan wanted us to insert including but not limited to, but I'm not sure where that was supposed to go. Do we know where that was supposed to go? And I'm assuming there's no objection to that?
I thought you said subsection I, but when I looked at that section, it already had that language.
Yeah, that's why I was
So maybe
little
somebody
confused.
caught it already.
right,
Yeah,
maybe.
I agree.
And then the other question I had was the subsection H, violate any law which prohibits discrimination. And you talked about that being a closed list, and you said, and so we extended it to any other class expressly protected by a local, state, or federal law. So I have maybe it's a very specific question. So on that list already is sexual preference and sexual orientation. But I've been hearing an increasing number of folks who are in what I'll call the transgender or the sexually fluid or sexual identification group who are having some difficulties with their landlords. And I don't know, because I haven't done civil rights law in a little bit, about the extent of those folks being protected classes at state or federal law. But if they aren't, is there a way to make them a protected class under local law? Because this does give us the option. It says if they're protected under local law.
The state law does include those folks. So
Okay, so I just wanted to make sure about that because
But should we add it to our law is the question.
yeah, we could. That we are.
I mean, I would love to specifically add transgender or sexual identity, or, because I do think, at least I have been hearing from people in that community that they've been suffering some discrimination in the housing market, even to the effect of landlords going into their units if they may sexually present as men at some times and going in and finding dresses and that sort of thing and assuming that they're transgender or something like that, or attempting to be transgender.
Yeah, I would just caution us in protected classes. There's a long history of how we got in this country to identifying protected classes, and I don't think you can equate sort of a person's physical sort of skin color, let's say, like someone who's black can't hide that they're black, Someone who's gay, a male, for example, who's gay, it's not as evident. And that's why protected classes has been historically, they're looking at issues of historic discrimination, by these groups. And I'm trying to understand sort of how a landlord can even go into an apartment and see a dress and then all of a sudden discriminate against that person. An African American, let's say, or a Latino, or someone of the traditional protected classes that we are accustomed to hearing about, that's something on the front end of the relationship of a tenant and a landlord, where you get discriminated against, you don't even get the apartment. The fact that in the example that you're given, this person is already housed, already received the apartment, and somehow a landlord, I don't even know how a landlord gets access to go look in a person's closet like that.
Wait, that's just her example. I mean,
mean,
what she's saying,
yeah,
I think, is that the same sort of discrimination that Black and brown people, people of color have had, it also extends to gay people, right? I mean, to other protected classes, including Section 8 tenants who certainly don't look any different than anyone else, right? So this is not something that's defined.
Section 8, I understand. I'm just trying to understand the reasoning of Councilwoman Davis in comparing sort of sexual orientation and race, for example, and making a comparison.
I don't think she did that. You did that.
Well, I'm saying,
It's, sexual orientation and sexual preference are already in the statute. All I'm trying to do is, those are now, maybe when this ordinance was originally written, those were sort of what people were focused on. They were focused on the gay or the LGBT. But now we know that that community is larger. For example, I have heard of people who have had conflicts with their landlords regarding their transgender status.
And that would be covered, though, under LGBTQ.
Well, right, that's what I was asking. He says that it's already covered by state law, but I'm just wondering, is there any harm if it's already covered by state law of inserting it into our local ordinance as well?
There's no reason you can't also repeat it in the local ordinance.
Right, so it seems to me for that community, and by the way, I did hear of someone who had a problem in their apartment. It was someone who most of the time physically presented as a male, but who was thought of themselves as transgender, and the landlord commented on the dresses in their apartment, and these dresses look like they can fit you, and, those shoes were, that sort of thing. And when you hear that, whether those comments are made in good faith or bad, it suggests that the landlord has an issue with someone who might consider themselves transgender or a transvestite. I mean, they don't necessarily have to be transgender. They could consider themselves a transvestite. My favorite comedian in the world is Eddie Izzard.
We're checking the state list right now to see
Okay.
how they expressed those.
Yeah, so I would just
need to
like
add.
to, we know right now that that is a particular community that is under assault across the United States. I mean, there literally now is a law in Florida that says if a student can't tell their teacher that they're gay or that they're transgender, and it seems to me this is a community that's under assault right now, and being able to offer them some protection within our own local statute, particularly if it's already included in the state law, would be beneficial. So I just wanted to mention that. If they're protected in state law, I'd like to include whatever language the state law has. And if it isn't, and maybe this isn't tonight, but it's something we think about, how do we extend local rights to that community?
and I want to clarify, because I don't want anything to be misinterpreted. I'm against all oppression, all discrimination against all people. I just wanted to understand your logic in terms of equating sort of a person's sexual orientation to a person's race, and I wanted to make it very clear that it's different on the front end of trying to get an apartment if you're African American, or even if you're a Section 8 holder. No one knows. You don't have. It doesn't. No one can see, for example, your sexual orientation.
Councilmember De La Torre, I think, one, I don't think that's what Councilmember Davis was saying at all. And two, and it's been a long, long time since I did constitutional law. But if I recall, one of the cases that led to LGBTQ folks being a protected class had to do with the sheer fact that it isn't something you necessarily see, but when you enter someone's house or, encounter this then that can create problems. And so they're as entitled to that right as a protected class as I am walking around with black skin. And so I don't even know why we're here having this conversation at this point. I think all Councilmember Davis is asking for is how do we ensure that just written into our local ordinance is language that's consistent with state and federal law, because it just makes a statement of our values. And so that's it. And then we can move on.
And I think the phrase would be gender identification. We could put it right after sexual orientation.
What I see is gender identity and gender expression.
Yeah,
Are the
I think
are the
that's
two
right.
terms that I see.
Yeah.
Right, because, right. I think that's fine. I just want to include some language to help what is a community that's currently feeling persecuted.
We've looked up Fair Employment and Housing Act, so gender identity, gender expression, those are the two.
Right, yeah, and that's in section H, right? I mean, you would add it to
Yeah,
the
so I would
list.
just like to see that language added to section H whenever somebody
Yeah.
makes a motion. And can I make it clear, I'm not trying to create a hierarchy of discrimination here. I'm not trying to say one is different or better or worse than the other. I'm just trying to say that we know that there are various communities that are suffering, and there's a community that doesn't seem to be addressed by the current language of this. I'm not certainly trying to minimize discrimination against people on the basis of race or gender or Section 8 eligibility or whatever, just trying to be more inclusive. That's all I'm trying to do.
Councilmember Brock.
Did Councilmember Davis just make a motion?
Sure, I'll move the staff report with my suggested changes to
And I'll second that.
Section H.
A motion by Davis, seconded by Brock. Any more discussion? Let's have a roll call vote.
Yes.
Councilmember Brock?
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem McCowen?
Yes.
Councilmember Negrete?
Yes.
Councilmember Davis?
Yes.
Councilmember Parr?
Yes.
And Mayor Himmerich?
Yes, and that passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Great report and great results lately. Thank you very much.
Okay. So next we have request of Councilmember De La Torre that the city council allocate $5,000 of council discretionary funds to the.
What about 16A?
Yeah.
Did I miss one?
Who?
Oh, gosh. Okay.
Oh, yeah, okay, so,
That's what it was.